In the first video about cryptography, we briefly mentioned that cryptography is often attacked through one or multiple of the following attack vectors. We distinguish traditional cryptanalysis, in which we attack the algorithms themselves, or we perform an exhaustive key search, a brute force attack. We might look at implementation errors, in which case the cryptographic cipher itself may be completely fine, but the way that we built it in computer code could be wrong. And then lastly, we looked at social engineering, which means that if I can convince someone to give up key material, for example through a phishing expedition, both my implementation could be correct as well as the cipher, but my data is still compromised. So in this section, we'll look a little closer at what some of those common mistakes look like. Now, we'll look at examples. What this is not meant to be, or could it ever be, a comprehensive list of everything that could possibly go wrong. But hopefully after completing this video, you'll have a better understanding of how hard it is to implement cryptography correctly. Cryptography is much like an arms race, and especially when it comes to the cipher aspect of it. The idea is that generally someone comes up with a new cipher, so a new algorithm of transforming a plain text into a ciphertext, and proposes that to the community as a whole. And at that point, a race begins. The race between cryptographers and cryptanalysts. The cryptanalysts will start picking apart the algorithm to look for potential vulnerabilities. We do know that pretty much all ciphers will have a limited shelf life. At some point, someone will discover a vulnerability that will make the cipher less than perfect, or at least close enough. Maybe computational resources have increased and our computers are now faster and they can things that they couldn't do before. Whatever the reason is, eventually a cipher will have to be retired. Now, important to realize is that it doesn't matter necessarily that a cipher has a theoretical vulnerability. Most of them do. But what we want it to be is hard enough that it is unreasonable to expect that even an opponent with sufficient resources can break a cipher, for example through an exhaustive key search, in a reasonable amount of time. And that's the key word, reasonable. Ciphers almost never provide unconditional security. There's really only one that we know of, the one-time pad, and that is impractical to use in a frequent setting. So unconditional security is not something we necessarily strive for. What we're looking for is computationally secure. For the time being, we're going to assume that computational resources are not strong enough to break this cipher or perform a brute force analysis of the key space. And that means that our computational capabilities really dictate how well a cipher can hold up. We'll look in a second at the DES algorithm, the data encryption standard. There's nothing wrong with the algorithm itself, but the key space was too small. And as a result, with current computers, we can easily run through the brute forcing the entire key space in a reasonable amount of time and recovering what keys were used. For newer ciphers like AES, the advanced encryption standard, the key space is so large that we don't expect a reasonable amount of time, anytime soon I should say, that keys are compromised. So we'll look into more detail into the data encryption standard itself, how it works on the inside in CSC 381 applied cryptography. But for now, what we have to remember is that the key is too small. It's only a 56-bit effective key to encrypt. Now that means that we at most have 2 to the power of 56 possible keys that we have to test before we've tested all keys in the key space. In practice, we have to test at most half of that. And that means that with current computers, we can do that pretty well. So even though DES itself isn't broken, our computers are so fast that we can enumerate the entire key space. And as a result, DES really should not be used anymore. The key takeaway from this is that if you use cryptography, you have to know what you are using and why you are using it. ideally, you keep an inventory somewhere that at any point in time you can go back and say, okay, what crypto is in use in my organization today? If you can do that and you learn that a cipher is becoming or has become deprecated, you can easily find out which products are affected. Attackers will keep these lists for you if you don't, so you want to know what ciphers are in use. You also want to develop your software in such a way that if one cipher becomes deprecated, you can switch to a different one. And we see that in modern software. For example, TLS, Transport Layer Security, is actually not a cryptographic cipher itself. It's an application, a protocol. But what they have done is not hard code the ciphers, they've made that configurable. So even if we know that a cipher becomes deprecated, the TLS folks say, okay, so we'll stop using it, we'll go to something else. That's built into the software, it does not require any software changes. Another example of a weak cipher is MD5, which is a hashing algorithm, one of those message digests. It is a very popular hashing algorithm still today, and it is readily available. It is built into all Macs, all Linux systems, and I'm sure even Windows systems have a built-in capability to calculate an MD5 hash of an input. But just because it's readily available doesn't mean it's a good plan to use it. And actually several severe vulnerabilities have already been detected in it. And as a result, since 1996, which is quite a while ago now, use of MD5 is strongly discouraged and the protocol itself has been deprecated. Now specifically, MD5 is susceptible to a collision attack, and a fast one too. You could potentially detect a collision within seconds. A collision happens when we have two inputs that calculate to the same hash. And that's something we want to avoid, because one of the reasons why we were using hashing algorithms is because they acted as a fingerprint, where my assumption was that no two files should be able to yield the same hash, at least not easily found. That's no longer the case for MD5. MD5 should not be used for security applications. That does not mean that it's useless. It can still be used as long as you don't expect security as a result. At this point though, there are so many good alternatives, better hash algorithms, faster hash algorithms. There's really no reason to continue using MD5 any longer. Another example of symmetric ciphers, of weak ciphers, is in modes of operation. A mode of operation is something that's specific to symmetric ciphers. A symmetric cipher, like AES for example, is limited at how much data it can encrypt at one time. That's called the block size. What the block size is varies per cipher. It's usually though stable depending on what the cipher is. So for example, AES has 128 bits on it. But that means if you're encrypting more than that, you'll have to do multiple blocks. And how you link those blocks together in order to make basically your big puzzle out of it is called the mode of operation. One way to do that is called cipher block chaining, and again in CSC 381 applied cryptography will explore in more detail what that means. But key takeaway is that for many years CBC was one of the default choices in TLS, the Transport Layer Security Protocol. And then in 2011 someone discovered an attack that was later called Beast in CBC, and the problem was that a successful attack using the Beast attack could give an ability to the attacker to recover plaintext. So even by interacting in this case with a web server for example, and injecting malicious traffic, the plaintext could be recovered even though the key was not known. No special privileges were needed for that, so it was a fairly dangerous attack. And as a result, CBC was a problem and was considered deprecated almost immediately when it was discovered that Beast could do this. Now the problem is when you turn off CBC from one day to the other, many of the people who connect to your system might not be able to switch to a new protocol. And TLS was able to do it, because TLS is fully configurable, but if the client doesn't implement those same changes, the communication stops. By now, it's no longer really an issue. CBC is becoming almost extinct the way it should be, but older systems might still have it enabled, and if you find a system that still supports CBC, you might be able to steal some information from it. So in practice, though, it means that most systems using crypto really should have moved to configurable cipher suites, where you can plug and play as to what ciphers you want to use. Yes, that has practical limitations. For example, you have to make sure that your clients and your servers support both of the ciphers that you're using through your cipher suite. But in the end, we know that ciphers have a limited shelf life and that we should be able to swap them out without much problem. Now, that also means that no one's going to give you a call and say, hey, by the way, we just deprecated this cipher. As a developer and as an operator of systems, you need to keep an eye on those things. Now, there's a lot of guidance available as to what is considered secure configuration, secure ciphers, and what isn't. And you need to keep track of that. The good news is that most vulnerability scanners will report on weak cipher suites or misconfigured ciphers. So you can easily identify where the problems exist. And then knowing that you have the problems, you can work towards remediation. One point to make, though, is that weak ciphers are not always exploitable. Ciphers are deprecated when we start believing that they might become exploitable. And if we do that, if we are able to stay ahead of that race where we deprecate ciphers as soon as we start seeing the first signs of weakness, we might actually stay ahead of the arms race as cryptographers. But the reality is there will always be places where weak ciphers continue to be used. Often, though, an attacker doesn't need to revert to cryptanalysis or to attacks against the cipher itself, because we have those other options. We can still attack implementation and we can still attack the users, and those are much easier and much more likely to succeed than these protocol attacks or these cipher attacks themselves are not all that common. So let's take a look at some of those operational issues in how to use crypto. Key reuse is an important one. So first, let's define forward secrecy. So it's an important concept in cryptography. It means that if I compromise your key, I might be able to decrypt the message that you are exchanging now, but I cannot go back and decrypt any older messages that you have sent using that same key. Potentially, though, going forward, I might be able to look over your shoulder. Especially in situations where you might be afraid of large-scale surveillance, where people are recording cryptographically protected conversations so that they can go back at a later stage to decode them. Forward secrecy, or perfect forward secrecy as it's sometimes known as also, is a good thing to have. The basic idea is that each message that we send is protected with a new session key. And that means that even if your attacker recovers your master key, they'll only have it for that session. We have techniques such as the Diffie-Hellman key exchange that we can exchange these session keys without actually ever sending them. So even if you can intercept the Diffie-Hellman key exchange that could be protected by one of those master keys, you still wouldn't know what the session key is for that particular situation. Again, CSC 381 Applied Crypto looks at that in more detail. But what we should take away from that is that key materials should never be reused. Use them once, discard them. It also means that if you're going to install new software, and sometimes that comes with pre-installed configuration keys, you should reset those and generate new key material. You should never use the same key between different instances of the same software. Once you've done that, you should also change those keys on a regular basis. And that's primarily to protect against keys that may have been intercepted. A key is only valid or usable as long as it's good. So if I change my keys on a regular basis, then I can only use it for that period of time. And ideally, that perfect forward secrecy, PFS, should be used when you can, although that's not always practical. TLS, Transport Layer Security, has the ability to implement perfect forward secrecy. And so there's almost no excuse if you're dealing with web-based applications not to use it. It does make debugging sometimes a little bit harder, especially if you're dealing with network packet captures. And that's why most web browsers do have the ability to accept a debug session in which they will save those session files to a text file. If that happens and you can get your hands on that session file, then tools like Wireshark can help decrypt HTTPS sessions as well. You'll need the session keys and you'll need the key that was used to encrypt, which is the public key, so that shouldn't be too hard to get your hands on. In addition to those key reuse, maybe the ultimate example of key reuse is the use of hard-coded credentials. So that means credentials that are programmed into source code. And that is something that you should never do. Keys, other secrets, configuration options, you should really never hard-code into software. That should always be put out external to the software, maybe in a configuration file, maybe in some form of another device. But definitely don't hard code, because at that point you can't change them without changing your source code and recompiling it. It also means that, you know, if you create your executables and ship them out to customers, all of the customers will be susceptible to that same username and password. Not a good plan, yet we see it everywhere. Some well-known examples, Cisco systems, who make network equipment, used to do this regularly. By now they have hopefully learned their lesson and don't do it anymore. But we still regularly see reports that, oh, another set of hard-coded credentials was found in Cisco devices. It makes sense from a developer point of view. If you're building software, if you're testing software, you want to be able to get into that software to see if it works correctly. And that's fine, but make sure you get rid of it before you finalize your build and you start shipping it to customers. The Mirai botnet was one of the largest botnets we have seen used for denial of service attacks. I want to say it was 61 different hard-coded credential pairs, primarily for Internet of Things devices. Too many devices that would still let you in with username, admin, password, admin, etc. Or maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it could be. And they use that to create large-scale denial of service attacks. And I think that to date, the largest denial of service attacks in terms of traffic volume generated has been attributed to the Mirai botnet. They peaked a little over a terabit per second. That's a lot of data. And Uber had a data breach where they had not only hard-coded their credentials into some app, that app was also on GitHub. So someone could just look through the GitHub repo, find the username and password, and use it to access Amazon Web Services to run virtual machines, and more importantly, to access storage and store data there. All of those were examples of hard-coded credentials. And really the only way to fix that is by shipping an update of your software to all your customers and then hoping that those customers install it on a timely basis. So those keys, secrets, and other configurations should always be external to your application. But of course, if you start taking all of those secrets and you put them in a configuration file, then you also have to protect that configuration file. And that again is another source of attacks, those configuration files containing vulnerable or sensitive information. Now, in any case, if you're going to do that, which you're encouraged to do, limit the read permissions on those files so that only the user who executes the program can read those files. Nobody else should. And that means that if an attacker gains access to your system, they might not be able to elevate their privileges right away, but at least they won't be able to read permissions from files where they have really no reasons being in. Also, don't put them in version control systems, especially public version control systems. Configuration file templates are fine, as long as the Placeholders for the actual secrets are under version control, but not the version control themselves. If you can, don't even make the secrets external to the application, make it external to the system itself by using hardware crypto devices, which are specific pieces of hardware that you can load these keys into. And then at that point, you can ask it questions. Is this correct? Yes or no? But you'll never be able to ask the question like, hey, what is the key? And if you can't ask that, you can't steal it. So there are ways to do this correctly. Typical places where you would look are web applications, because many web applications are developed as multi-tiered applications. And many of those will still use usernames and passwords to connect to backend databases. Those have to be kept somewhere. They're in configuration files. If you can access those configuration files, you might be able to intercept those usernames and passwords. If the database runs on the same system as the web application, use OS level authentication whenever possible. If it's a remote system, you'll have to come up with a better way. Hopefully some form of asymmetric encryption becomes possible at that point. Implementation mistakes regarding to random data are commonplace also. So first off, if you're going to create database backends, it's very tempting to start using identifiers. Your first record is record number 1 or maybe 0. The second one is 1, 2, 3, etc. And so you're going to incrementally, sequentially number your records. If you're using those same identifiers in your application, and especially if that area is accessible by an attacker, the attacker can use that to enumerate the contents of your database, maybe just by switching a number in a URL, for example. Bad practice. What you probably want to do is generate random identifiers and use those so that at least the sequential enumeration attacks don't work, or they don't work as well, at least. What we want to do is using those random identifiers. Now, random is a concept we'll also explore more in CSC 381, Applied Cryptography. But the basic answer is computers are not good at random. They're good at something called pseudo-random, which means like random. But that also means not random at all. Most random number generators are actually highly deterministic. And their sequence of numbers, until they cycle, depends on an initial seed. And that means that not all random number generators are cryptographically secure. And the distinction between a pseudo-random number generator and a cryptographically secure pseudo-random number generator is that predictability. If I can observe a sequence of numbers, I still shouldn't be able to figure out what the next one is going to be. Some random number generators will let you do that. So choosing the right random number generator is always a big challenge. The other part is that the random numbers must be large enough that they're brute force resistant. If I'm picking a random number between 0 and 1,000, it doesn't really matter that it's random. I can just enumerate those 1,000 numbers. I have to make my random number space much larger than the space I actually need, so I'm becoming resistant to enumeration. We have seen this go wrong in some examples. The best way to prevent that is to follow guidance that is given. Follow the specifications that comes with these pseudo-random number generators. For example, most of them need to be initialized before you start pulling data from it, but they need to be initialized only once, not each time that you pull a number from it. As soon as you start doing that, you're reducing their randomness or their effectiveness. Recently, an attack against Zoom, our meeting system, was published. And that basically means that Zoom meetings are random numbers, but they're only between 9 and 11 digits long. And that severely limits the key space. As long as I test all 9-digit, all 10-digit, and all 11-digit numbers, I will land on Zoom spaces, and they might be open to the public, where they maybe shouldn't be. So computer-based tools can enumerate that space relatively quickly. Had they used a larger identifier that was randomly generated as well, this would have been much harder. It would also have been less user-friendly, and that's always, of course, the give and take that we're dealing with. Supply chains is an important one too. So let's take a look at Heartbleed. In 2014, a bunch of researchers discovered a vulnerability in OpenSSL. OpenSSL is a very popular free open source cryptographic library. It's used just about anywhere. The problem was that this bug potentially allowed anyone to read the memory of systems from a remote location that was using this library. And so what's stored in memory? Well, just about anything. Key material is cached in memory, sensitive data is cached in memory, and this vulnerability potentially gave attackers access to all of that data. Now, that problem itself was relatively quickly fixed. OpenSSL, as soon as they became aware of it, had the fix out relatively quick. But very many situations came out where vendors were using OpenSSL, and that's fine, they're allowed to do that in their products. And they shipped those products to customers. But what they shipped was a copy of SSL rather than a reference to SSL. And that meant that OpenSSL can update all it wants, but until the vendor ships an updated copy to a customer, the customer doesn't have it. It doesn't have the fix. Many organizations were also not even aware that their products had OpenSSL in it. And so that's a bad combination, where on the one hand, your vendor is shipping you outdated software, and on the other hand, you don't even know that you have that outdated software. And so that was a problem. And because they weren't aware, many organizations did not patch on time. They didn't prioritize their patching. Most software that we use today has an elaborate supply chain in it. We're always pulling in components, libraries from other places. And even though our own software might be secure, as long as upstream, somewhere else in the software that we use there's a bug, we are affected by that as well. And attackers know that. So they will try to map out the supply chain of your software if they're trying to attack it. And that means that you shouldn't be shipping software that you don't maintain yourself. You should be shipping references to that. And you should really stay up to date with a good vulnerability management system. The biggest threat against encryption is not using encryption at all, though. Even though using encryption is very hard, not doing it is harder. And so there are still many places in which applications do not use cryptographic protections, even when they're working with confidential information. In some cases, that is because the developers think it's too difficult to do that. In other cases, system administrators might make the assessment and say, nah, this is just an internal site. We don't have to make it more complicated. There could be all kinds of different reasons. And others might not even know that sensitive information is being stored or transferred by the system. It is true that cryptography adds overhead, it adds complexity, but it's not a reason to not use it. So what do we need? Thinking from an attacker mindset. So what we're going to be doing is look for applications that might use default and or hard-coded key materials. This is exactly the same thing when we talked about password security. If the passwords are hard-coded, good, thank you very much, I'm in. We might look through source code repositories for published keys, although that is getting less effective. For example, GitHub now has regular jobs running that scan through all the public repositories and alerts developers when they see something that looks like hard-coded credentials or uploaded information, but it's still up to the developer then to fix that. We can look for those unprotected configuration files containing secrets once we gain initial access to a system. So we might start looking at our web applications configuration files and see if there's a database cred in it or some other kind of notes file. If we see key spaces that can be enumerated, we might just whip up a quick tool and do that, see how it goes. And of course, the supply chains that might include all the components is also worth looking for. And lastly, look for plaintext data. If the encryption hasn't been used, then we're in the clear right then. And of course, as a last resort, cryptographic attacks against the applications themselves. Hopefully what I'm trying to make clear with this, and I should have put that on a single slide by itself, maybe I'll do that later on, Don't invent your own crypto. Use what's there and follow their guidance. Use it wherever you can. Do that, do it well, and you should be good to go.